He had faced enemy fire in 3 countries, survived underwater demolitions, and carried wounded brothers through hell. But the moment a man grabbed a woman's wrist in a quiet diner, and every single person in that room looked away, Cole Maddox felt something shift inside his chest that no amount of combat training had ever prepared him for. Not fear. Something colder, something older. The kind of feeling that tells a man exactly who he is when no one is watching. Tonight, in a corner booth of a neighborhood diner, a Navy SEAL would remind an entire room what courage actually looks like. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because part 1 starts right here. The rain had been falling since 4 o'clock, the kind of slow, indifferent drizzle that didn't bother announcing itself. It just showed up and made everything heavier. By the time Cole Maddox pulled his truck into the parking lot of Patty's Corner Diner, the asphalt had turned the color of old pewter, and the neon sign above the entrance was throwing a trembling pink glow across the puddles. He sat in the truck for a moment after killing the engine, not for any particular reason, just habit. He always gave himself a few seconds between whatever he'd been doing and wherever he was going. His therapist years ago had called it decompression. Cole had called it common sense. Either way, he did it. "Dad, it's raining." Ava was already unclipping her seatbelt, her backpack half-zipped, a drawing of something, horses, probably, always horses, sticking out the top. She was 9 years old and had inherited her mother's complete intolerance for waiting. "I know it's raining, so why are we sitting here?" "Because I'm driving." "You stopped driving like 2 minutes ago." Cole looked at her. She looked back at him with those wide, dark eyes that had been his undoing since the first moment he'd held her in a hospital room in San Diego, 7 pounds 4 ounces, furious about being born. She still had that same expression sometimes, like the world was slightly failing to meet her expectations. "Let's go," he said, and pushed open the door. They ran the 20 feet from the truck to the diner entrance in a sprint that served no real purpose since they were soaked anyway. Ava laughed when she hit the doormat, shaking her head like a wet dog, and Cole held the door while the warmth of the place reached out and pulled them both in. Patty's Corner Diner smelled the way diners were supposed to smell: coffee and butter and something faintly sweet from the pie shelf near the register. The booths were red vinyl, cracked in places and patched with electrical tape that someone had made no effort to color match. The floor tiles were off-white with flecks of brown, and they'd been mopped so many times the pattern near the entrance was nearly gone. A small television above the counter was muted, showing a weather map of the state, all blues and greens crawling toward the coast. It was Friday, their Friday. This had been their Friday for almost 2 years, ever since Cole had moved them to Delwood after leaving active duty service, after everything. A small city in the mid-Atlantic, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' first names and the grocery store still had a bulletin board with paper flyers pinned to it. Not exciting, not dangerous, exactly what he'd been looking for. "Your usual booth's open," called a voice from behind the counter. Victoria Sinclair was already reaching for the coffee carafe before they'd made it 4 steps inside. She was 30 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that depending on the moment. Younger when she laughed, older when she thought nobody was looking. She had dark hair she kept pulled back at work, and she wore the diner uniform, black slacks, white shirt, the little red apron, like someone who had made a private decision to be completely present in whatever she was doing, no matter what it was. Cole had noticed her the first night they'd come here, not in the way people sometimes assumed when they found out he was a single father noticing a woman. He'd noticed her the way he'd been trained to notice things, the way she read a table before she approached it, the way she remembered orders without writing them down, the way she managed 3 sections at once without appearing rushed. She was good at her job, genuinely good, and in Cole's experience, people who were that good at something difficult but supposedly simple were usually that way for a reason. He'd learned her name around the 3rd or 4th visit. They'd been coming here long enough now that there was an ease between them. Not friendship exactly, more like the comfortable recognition of 2 people who respected each other's routine. "Hey, Victoria," Ava said, dropping into the booth by the window with the authority of someone claiming territory. "Hey, Trouble," Victoria said, and set a Sprite in front of her before she'd even asked. "How was school this week?" "We had a math test." "How'd you do?" Ava made a face that answered the question more completely than any grade could have. Victoria smiled and looked at Cole. "Coffee?" "Please." She poured it and left the carafe on the table, which was something she only did for regulars she trusted not to abuse the privilege. Cole wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the rain-blurred street. A car slid past, headlights smearing yellow across the wet glass. "You look tired," Victoria said. She wasn't being rude about it. She had the kind of directness that came without cruelty. "Long week. Anything interesting?" He shook his head. Cole worked as a maintenance supervisor for a regional facilities company, which meant he spent his days managing a team of technicians who kept office buildings and commercial properties from falling apart. It was detail work, unglamorous, exactly what he needed, something that required his full attention without requiring anything else. "Burst pipe on the 4th floor of a medical office building," he said. "Wednesday. Took 11 hours. Fun. Thrilling." Ava was drawing on a paper napkin with a pen she'd produced from somewhere in her backpack. The horses again. She had a gift for it, actually. Even Cole, who knew nothing about art, could tell that. Her mother had been the same way. He didn't let himself stay on that thought. He was better at redirecting than he used to be, though it still cost him something each time. "The meatloaf's good tonight," Victoria said. "Bobby actually followed the recipe for once." High praise. "I'm serious, I was shocked." Ava looked up from her drawing. "Can I get the grilled cheese?" "You always get the grilled cheese," Cole said, "because it's always good." He couldn't argue with that logic. He ordered the meatloaf on Victoria's recommendation, and she disappeared toward the kitchen, pausing to refill the coffee of an older couple 2 booths down and dropping a check at the counter without breaking stride. The diner was about 2/3 full. Friday night crowd. Families, a few couples, some guys in work clothes who'd stopped in after a job. The rain had slowed foot traffic a little, but Patty's Corner had the kind of reputation that brought people in regardless of weather. It wasn't fancy. It didn't try to be. That was the point. Cole let himself relax into the booth. This was the part of the week he held on to. The hour and a half where he didn't have to be responsible for anything larger than making sure Ava ate something green, which he was already losing because the grilled cheese came with coleslaw that she was absolutely going to ignore. "Dad." "Yeah." "Do you think people can tell when you're pretending to be okay?" He looked up from his coffee. Ava was still drawing, her pen moving in careful circles, but there was a different quality to her stillness. The question hadn't come from nowhere, which meant something had happened this week that she'd been carrying around, deciding when to put down. "Sometimes," he said carefully. "Why?" She shrugged in the way that meant it wasn't a shrug at all. "Maya at school, she keeps saying everything's fine, but you can just tell." "Tell what?" "That it's not." Cole set down his mug. "Did something happen with Maya?" "Her parents are getting divorced. She didn't say so, but everyone kind of knows. And she keeps acting like everything's totally normal, but at lunch yesterday she just stared at her food for like 10 whole minutes and didn't eat anything. And when I asked if she was okay, she said, 'I'm great.' And she didn't look great, Dad. She looked like the opposite of great." He was quiet for a moment. Ava had her mother's emotional radar, the ability to pick up what other people were radiating even when they were doing their best to block the signal. It had been both a gift and a burden for her mother. He suspected it would be the same for his daughter. "Did you say anything else to her?" "I just sat next to her. I didn't know what to say." "That was the right call." She looked up. "Really?" "Really. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just be next to them. You don't have to fix it. You just have to show up." Ava considered this with the serious expression she used when she was actually filing something away for later, rather than just appearing to listen. Then she went back to her drawing. Cole picked up his coffee. Outside, the rain had eased to something barely there, more a mist than a drizzle, catching the light from the street lamps. The bell above the door rang. He didn't look up right away. He almost never looked up when the door opened. Old instinct. The decision about whether to assess an entrance was made before the assessment happened, based on secondary information. Sound of the door, sound of footsteps on the mat, sound of voices. Most of the time, it was nothing. This time, Something in the quality of the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It was actually the opposite, a small subtraction of noise, the particular quiet that happens when a group of people simultaneously recalibrate. Cole set down his mug and looked toward the entrance. The man who'd walked in was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the build of someone who'd been athletic once and was now maintaining the shape of it with money rather than effort. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Cole's truck. Not that Cole knew anything about suits. But there was a difference between clothes that fit and clothes that were constructed, and this was the latter. Dark charcoal, no tie, collar open. A watch on his left wrist that caught the diner light in a way that felt intentional. He had silver hair, groomed back, and the kind of face that had never had to work hard for a room's attention because wealth had always cleared the path ahead of it. He was with no one. He looked around the diner the way people look at places they've been talked into against their better judgment. A younger man in a similar suit had held the door for him and now hovered 2 feet behind like a shape more than a person. The assistant, Cole read, before the thought had fully formed. Somebody who'd learned that his job was to disappear unless called upon. The man in the charcoal suit scanned the diner and selected a booth near the center with the decisive efficiency of someone who made choices for a living and didn't second-guess them. He sat. The assistant took the seat across from him and immediately produced a phone, placing it on the table face up. Victoria appeared with 2 menus. "Good evening," she said, setting them down with the same warmth she brought to every table. "Welcome to Patty's. Can I start you gentlemen off with something to drink?" The man in the suit didn't look at her. He was looking at something on the assistant's phone, leaning forward slightly. "Coffee," he said, "and make sure it's fresh. The last place I was at served me something that had been sitting for 2 hours." Victoria nodded. "Absolutely. And for you?" She looked at the assistant. "Water," he said quietly, without looking up from the phone. She went for the coffee. Cole watched the exchange the way he watched most things. Not obviously, not with any particular purpose, just with the background attention he kept running at all times. The man hadn't been rude exactly. He'd been dismissive. There was a difference, though the line between them had a way of not staying fixed. Cole turned back to Ava, who was now adding what appeared to be offense to her drawing. "That looks good," he said. "It's not done." She tilted it toward him briefly, then pulled it back. The protective instinct of any artist who wasn't finished yet. Victoria returned with the coffee and set it down. "Ready to order, or do you need another minute?" The man picked up the menu, scanned it for 4 seconds, and set it down. "I'll have the steak. The ribeye? Is there another one?" "No, sir, just confirming." She smiled. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was close enough. "How would you like it?" "Medium rare. And I want the vegetables on the side, not mixed in. And I want real butter on the bread, not whatever low-fat substitute you people think is acceptable." "You people" landed on the table between them like something dropped from a height. Victoria's smile held. "Of course. Ribeye, medium rare, vegetables separate, real butter on the bread." She looked at the assistant. "And for you?" "Just the water is fine." She gathered the menus and moved away. Cole tracked her with peripheral vision. The way her shoulders were set, the small controlled exhale she let out once her back was to the table. He looked down at his coffee. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into situations that weren't his. He'd spent enough years watching what happened when people acted on incomplete information, when the impulse to engage outran the judgment about whether to. You could do real damage that way. He knew this. The meatloaf arrived. Victoria set it down in front of him with a quick smile, a real one this time, and put Ava's grilled cheese in front of her with a separate small plate of coleslaw that neither of them expected Ava to touch. "This looks amazing," Ava said, and meant it. "Bobby's having a good night," Victoria said. "Don't tell him. His head's big enough." Ava laughed. Cole cut into the meatloaf. It was good, actually good, with the kind of depth that came from someone who'd been making the same thing for 20 years and had stopped thinking about it, which paradoxically was when food started telling the truth. For a few minutes, the diner settled back into its ordinary rhythms. The older couple in the corner booth were sharing a piece of pie. Someone near the counter was telling a story that kept almost reaching a punchline. The television above the register had switched from the weather to what looked like a local news segment, still muted. Then the man in the charcoal suit spoke again, and this time it was loud enough to carry. "This coffee is cold." Victoria had been passing his table with a tray for another section. She stopped. "I'm sorry about that. Let me get you a fresh—" "I asked for fresh coffee when I sat down." He pushed the cup toward the edge of the table, not handing it to her, just pushing it. "I specifically said fresh." "I understand. I'll replace it right away." She reached for the cup. In the same motion, she reached past it to straighten the small creamer caddy that had been knocked sideways. Just a reflex, a small act of tidying, and her elbow barely grazed the edge of his water glass. Not enough to move it, barely a brush. The man pulled back from the table as though he'd been doused. "Are you serious?" His voice had gone flat in the specific way that wasn't about the water at all. "Do you have any idea how to do your job?" "Sir, I apologize, I didn't—" "My jacket." He was looking down at his sleeve, turning it, examining it with the theatrical horror of someone performing outrage for an audience rather than experiencing it. "Do you know what this jacket cost?" The diner had gone quiet again. That same subtraction of ambient sound, faster this time, deeper. Forks set down. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence. "Sir, if there's any damage—" "There's no damage," the assistant said, very quietly, barely audible. He was looking at the table. The man in the charcoal suit ignored him. "I come in here trying to have a simple meal, and I have to deal with—" He gestured at Victoria in a way that managed to be an insult without forming a specific shape. Just a gesture, just a direction, just a hand waving toward a person like they were something in the way. Victoria stood very still. Her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has learned to absorb impact without showing where it lands. "I'll replace your coffee," she said. Her voice was even. "If there's been any staining to your jacket, please leave your contact information with the manager and we'll discuss compensation." She turned to go. His hand shot out and closed around her wrist. Not roughly, in the way that looks like violence. Precisely, in the way that announces control. A grip that said, "I'm not done with you," without raising his voice. "I didn't say you could go." The room crystallized. Nobody moved. Not the older couple with their pie. Not the guys from the job site in their worn Carhartt jackets. Not the family near the back whose kids had stopped their bickering with the instinctive animal awareness that something was wrong. Nobody moved. Except Cole Maddox, who set down his fork, placed his napkin on the table beside his plate, and stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice before he'd said anything. He crossed the 8 feet between his booth and the man's table at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, just deliberate. The walk of someone who had already decided and was simply covering the distance. He stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the man's hand on Victoria's wrist. Then he looked at the man's face. "Let go of her arm," Cole said. His voice was quiet. Completely level. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from trying to stay calm, but from actually being calm. The way a deep river is calm. Not because nothing is moving, but because everything moving is moving together. The man looked up at him. Took him in. The worn flannel, the maintenance company logo on Cole's jacket, the face that didn't offer anything easy to read. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never, in 50-some years, lost an encounter with someone who worked with their hands. "And who," he said, "are you?" Cole held his gaze. "I'm the man who asked you to let go of her arm," he said. "I won't ask again." The man's smile didn't disappear right away. It took a few seconds, the way a light takes a moment to fully go out after you flip the switch, a slow dimming rather than an instant cut. He was still holding Victoria's wrist. His fingers hadn't moved, but something behind his eyes had shifted, recalibrating, trying to place Cole in a category he recognized. He couldn't find one. That was visible too. "I don't know who you think you are," the man said, and there was still performance in his voice, still the practiced register of someone accustomed to winning rooms. "But I'm in the middle of a conversation." "No," Cole said. "You're holding someone's arm against their will. That's not a conversation." Victoria hadn't moved. She was standing very still, her wrist still caught, and Cole could see from the angle of her shoulder that she was working hard to keep her breathing even. She wasn't afraid exactly. Or maybe she was, but fear wasn't the loudest thing on her face. The loudest thing was the particular exhaustion of someone who has been in this position before and has learned that making it worse helps nothing. Cole recognized that look. He'd seen it in places he didn't think about anymore if he could help it. The assistant, the younger man in the other suit, had set his phone face down on the table. He was staring at it. His jaw was tight. He knew, Cole read, that this was wrong. He just hadn't decided yet what that knowledge required of him. Cole pulled out the chair at the nearest empty table and sat down in it, turning it slightly to face the man in the charcoal suit. He did it slowly, without any drama, like someone settling in for a conversation that was going to take as long as it took. The man blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting, an argument, a threat, a retreat, it wasn't this. "What are you doing?" he said. "Waiting," Cole said. "Waiting for what?" "For you to let go of her arm." A muscle in the man's jaw moved. "I'll call the police." "Okay," Cole said. "That works. They can sort out which one of us has our hand on someone who doesn't want to be touched." The grip loosened. It didn't release. Not yet. But the certainty went out of it, the pressure dropping from a declaration to a question. Victoria felt it. Cole saw her shift her weight, just slightly, toward her own center of gravity rather than away from the man's hand. "You have no idea," the man said, and now the performance was thinning, something rawer starting to show underneath it. "Who you're talking to." "I really don't," Cole said. He wasn't being sarcastic. He meant it plainly. "And I don't need to. Doesn't change anything." The man finally released Victoria's wrist. She didn't rub it, didn't look at it, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing that it had mattered. She just took one step back, smooth and controlled, and stood with her hands at her sides. "Thank you," Cole said to the man, and meant that plainly, too. Victoria looked at Cole. A quick, contained look, the kind that carries more than it shows. And then she said quietly, "I'll get your coffee replaced, sir," and walked toward the counter with her back straight. The man in the charcoal suit stared at Cole. Cole didn't stare back. He just sat in the borrowed chair with his hands resting loose on his knees, looking at the man the way you look at a road you're not sure about. Attentive, patient, not committed to a direction yet. "You're going to regret this," the man said. His voice had dropped into something more private, less staged. "I want you to understand that. Whatever you think you just accomplished, you're going to regret it." "Maybe," Cole said, "but not tonight." He stood, replaced the chair at its original table, and walked back to his booth. Ava was watching him with enormous eyes over the top of her grilled cheese sandwich. "Dad?" she said, very carefully, when he sat down. "Yeah." "Who's that man?" "Don't know." "He looks really mad." "He is." She looked at the man's table, then back at Cole. "Are you in trouble?" Cole picked up his fork and cut into his meatloaf, which had gotten slightly cold but was still good. "No," he said. "Eat your dinner." She ate, but she kept glancing toward the center of the diner with the alert watchfulness of a child who has learned, through some specific education that Cole wished he could have spared her, that trouble doesn't always announce itself before it arrives. At the man's table, nothing moved for almost a full minute. The assistant had retrieved his phone and was staring at it again, his shoulders carrying the compressed posture of someone trying to become invisible. The man in the charcoal suit sat with his arms crossed, the cold coffee still at the edge of the table where Victoria had left it, untouched. Then he uncrossed his arms, straightened his jacket, and looked around the diner with the deliberate survey of someone deciding how to reassert control over a room that had quietly slipped out of his grip. His eyes landed on Victoria, who was behind the counter now, exchanging a word with the cook through the service window. He watched her the way a man watches something he's decided belongs to him even after it's walked away. Cole watched him watching her and kept eating. Victoria came back around the counter with a fresh coffee carafe and made her rounds of the room. The older couple, a table of 4 near the window, a man alone at the counter with a newspaper. She was working efficiently, professionally, but Cole noticed she was routing herself to avoid the center table, coming at it only when she couldn't reasonably go around. When she finally refilled the man's coffee, she did it from a distance that was technically professional and actually deliberate, tilting the carafe over the cup without leaning in, without making herself any smaller than she needed to be. Finally, the man said. Victoria said nothing. I asked for this 20 minutes ago. I understand. I apologize for the wait. Do you? He picked up the cup, sipped it, set it down. His eyes moved to the service window, to the cook visible beyond it. I want to speak to your manager. Of course. She still hadn't looked away from a point somewhere past his shoulder. I'll let him know. She turned. He spoke again. I'm not finished. She stopped walking, turned back slowly. I want to make sure it's documented, he said. What happened here? Your performance tonight. He paused, letting the words sit. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about who was at fault. The older couple in the corner booth had stopped pretending to eat their pie. The guys from the work site had gone completely still, the way large, quiet men go still when they've decided to wait and see without committing yet to what they're waiting to see. The family in the back, Cole had noticed a father, a mother, 2 kids, maybe 7 and 10. The father had put his hand flat on the table in a way that wasn't casual. The room was doing the math. Cole could feel it, that distributed calculation, the collective weighing of what was happening against what it would cost to do something about it. Most people, in his experience, could feel when something was wrong. That wasn't the hard part. The hard part was what you did with the feeling when doing something meant putting yourself in it. I'll let the manager know you'd like to speak with him, Victoria said, and her voice was steady in a way that was costing her. Cole could hear the cost. She started to turn again. You know what your problem is? The man said. He said it to her back. You don't know your place. The room didn't make a sound. Victoria stopped. Her back was to the man, and Cole could see her profile from his booth, the set of her jaw, the small, tight breath she pulled in through her nose. Her hands were at her sides, and one of them, the right one, the one that had been grabbed, closed briefly into a fist and then opened. She turned around slowly. I'm sorry, she said, very quiet. You heard me. He leaned back in his booth with the physical ease of a man who believed the conversation was already over. You work at a diner. That's your place. Act like it. Something passed across Victoria's face that was more complicated than anger. It was the expression of someone who has heard a variation of this sentence enough times that it has worn a groove, and who is in that moment making a decision about whether to let it wear any deeper. She opened her mouth. Cole spoke first. You know, he said from his booth, I've met a lot of men who talk like you. He said it conversationally, the way you'd mentioned the weather. Not loud. He wasn't performing for the room. He was just talking to the man, the way one person talks to another when they've decided the conversation needs to happen. The man looked at him. Something tightened around his eyes. I thought we were finished. So did I, Cole said, but then you kept going. I'm going to ask you to mind your own business. I heard that last time too. Cole set his fork down and folded his hands on the table. Here's the thing. I've been sitting in this booth every Friday for almost 2 years. This woman has brought me coffee and fed my daughter dinner and remembered that Ava doesn't like pickles without being told twice. And she does all of that without making anyone feel small for needing it. That kind of work is harder than it looks, and I don't like watching someone treat it like it's nothing. The man let a long breath out through his nose. Are you under the impression, he said, with the deliberate patience of someone explaining something to a person they consider stupid, that your opinion matters here? Do you know what I'm worth? No idea, Cole said. Then let me help you understand something. I have lawyers on retainer who make more in a month than you probably see in 5 years. I have one phone call between me and making your life considerably more complicated than it needs to be. I don't know what you do for a living. His eyes moved briefly over Cole's jacket, the logo, and came back with the satisfied conclusion of a man who has found his footing. But I'd imagine it's not the kind of job that can survive much complication. He was good at it, Cole had to admit. The delivery was practiced and smooth, and it had probably worked many times on many people, because it was targeted. It knew where most people kept their fear, their livelihood, their stability, the roof over their kid's head. Cole thought about that for a moment. He thought about the pipe that had burst on the 4th floor of the medical building on Wednesday. and the 11 hours he'd spent in crawl spaces and utility corridors getting it fixed, and the men on his crew who'd worked past dark without complaint, because that was what the job required. And he thought about how none of them would trade places with the man sitting across the diner in a suit that cost more than their monthly take-home. That might be true, Cole said. The lawyers and all of that. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. He unfolded his hands and sat back. But here's what I know about men who lead with what they're worth. Usually it's because they don't have much else to lead with. The silence that followed was a particular kind. Not empty, but charged, the way air feels before lightning. The man's face had changed. Not into anger exactly, but into something sharper and less controlled. The look of someone who has had the ground shift under them and hasn't yet figured out where to put their weight. You think you're better than me, he said. No, Cole said. I really don't. I think you're probably fine most of the time to most people. I think tonight you're having a bad night and taking it out on whoever's closest. I think you grabbed a woman's wrist because you could and you needed to feel that you could. He paused. I think that's worth looking at when you get home. Don't, the man said, and there was something that might have been warning in it, or might have been something rawer. Don't do that. Do what? Act like you know me. I don't know you, Cole said. I know what I've seen tonight. That's all. The assistant had gone completely still across the table, his phone forgotten in his hand, his eyes moving between Cole and his employer with the expression of someone who has realized he is witnessing something he is going to think about for a long time. At the counter, the cook had appeared in the service window. A large man named Bobby, Cole had learned over 2 years of Fridays, who had strong opinions about meatloaf and very little patience for anything he considered noise. He was watching now. He didn't say anything. Victoria had taken 3 steps back toward the center of the room during Cole's exchange with the man. She hadn't intended to, probably. It was the body's adjustment, the unconscious movement toward something that felt stable. She was standing now between 2 empty tables, and she was looking at Cole with an expression he couldn't entirely read, but that contained something like the specific relief of someone who has been carrying weight alone and has just been told, without ceremony, that they don't have to. He looked back at her briefly, just a glance, and then looked at the man again. The man looked around the room. It was the first time he'd really looked at it, not scanning for service, not performing for an imagined audience, but actually taking in the people who were there. The older couple, the work crew, the family in the back, the man at the counter with the newspaper who had given it up entirely and was now just watching with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Nobody looked away. In Cole's experience, there were 2 kinds of courage in a room like this. The first kind was the dramatic kind, standing up, saying something, putting yourself visibly on the line. Most people didn't have that kind readily available, and that was normal, and he'd stopped judging it years ago. The second kind was quieter, and in some ways harder, refusing to pretend you hadn't seen something, refusing to perform comfort when you weren't comfortable, just sitting in the clear, still light of your own disapproval and not hiding it. The room was doing the second kind. Every table, every face, steady and unmistakably present. The man in the charcoal suit understood finally what kind of room he was in. His jaw worked slightly. He smoothed the front of his jacket with both hands, a gesture Cole recognized as the physical version of reaching for composure when you've run out of words. He looked at the assistant, who kept his eyes on the table. I want the check, the man said. He said it to no one in particular. To the air. Victoria looked at Cole once more, that same contained, complicated look, and walked to the register. Cole picked up his fork and went back to the meatloaf. Ava had been watching the whole exchange with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was trying to memorize. Dad, she said. Yeah. That man. She glanced toward the center table, then pulled her eyes back. He's used to winning, isn't he? Cole chewed, swallowed, looked at his daughter. What makes you say that? Because he looks like someone who forgot how to lose. She pushed a piece of coleslaw around her plate with her fork, thoughtful. Maya's dad is kind of like that. Not that bad, but kind of. Cole looked at her. 9 years old, and she had already worked out something that some people never did. That the need to dominate a room was almost always the shape that a particular kind of fear took when it had been left unaddressed long enough. "Yeah," he said, "you're right." She nodded, satisfied, and took a bite of her grilled cheese. At the center table, the man in the charcoal suit sat in the particular stillness of someone who is waiting for a room to forget them. But rooms don't forget quickly, not when something real has happened in them, not when the air has changed and settled into a new configuration. The people around him weren't hostile exactly. They were just present, just there, and somehow that was worse. Victoria brought the check. She set it on the edge of the table without comment and started to walk away. "Miss," the man said. She stopped, turned. He looked at her for a moment. His expression had shifted into something harder to name, not quite regret, not quite apology, but something in that general neighborhood that hadn't found its shape yet. "The ribeye," he said. "I didn't order it." Victoria looked at him. "No, sir, you didn't." A beat. "I'll take it off," she said quietly. She took the check back and walked to the register, and the man watched her go with the expression of someone trying to work out whether they've just made a gesture or a concession and not being entirely sure which mattered more. The assistant picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. Finally, he looked at his employer and said, very quietly, barely carrying across the table, "Mr. Hargrove." The man, Hargrove, looked at him. "Maybe we should go." Hargrove didn't answer. He just pulled his jacket straight, reached into the interior pocket, and produced a money clip. He counted out bills without looking at the denominations, set them on the table, too many, Cole could see from across the room, substantially more than the check could have been, and stood. He walked toward the door without looking at anyone. The assistant followed, 2 feet behind, like a shape more than a person, same as when they'd arrived. At the door, Hargrove stopped. Cole kept his eyes on his plate but tracked the pause in his peripheral vision, the way he tracked everything. Hargrove didn't turn around. He just stood at the door for 2 or 3 seconds, his hand on the push bar, and then he pushed it open and walked out into the rain-misted street and let the door swing shut behind him. The bell above it rang once, clear and light, and for a moment the whole diner was perfectly still. The bell above the door stopped ringing, and the silence that followed it lasted maybe 4 seconds. Not long. Just long enough for the room to breathe out. Then Bobby's voice came through the service window, rough and unhurried, the way Bobby said most things. "Somebody want to tell me what I missed?" It broke the spell cleanly. A few people laughed, not loud, not the full release of tension, but the first crack in it, the kind of laughter that acknowledges a shared experience without needing to name it. The older couple in the corner booth resumed their pie. The guys from the work site settled back into their seats with the particular ease of men who have assessed something and decided it's resolved. The father in the back booth said something quiet to his wife, and she nodded, and the 2 kids went back to whatever argument they'd abandoned. The room reassembled itself, piece by piece, into something close to what it had been before Hargrove walked in. Not identical. The air still had a different quality to it. The specific weight that settles after something almost happened and then didn't. But the worst of it had lifted. Victoria stood at the register with the revised check in one hand and the bills Hargrove had left on the table in the other. She counted them once, quietly, and then stood there holding them for a moment with an expression Cole couldn't read from across the room. He went back to his dinner. "You're not going to eat that coleslaw," he said to Ava. "I might." "You won't." She pushed it 2 inches to the left, which was apparently her version of a rebuttal. Then she said, without looking up from what remained of her drawing, "Do you know that man? The one who left?" "No." "Have you seen him before?" "No." "So you just—" She paused, working out how to say it. "You just did that for someone you don't even know?" Cole thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being a lecture, because Ava had a finely calibrated detector for when she was being taught at rather than talked to, and the detector usually triggered a shutdown. "Yeah," he said. She processed this. Her pen moved across the napkin. "Okay," she said finally, and the way she said it suggested it was more than okay, that it was something she was filing under a category that mattered to her, though she wasn't going to tell him that directly because she was 9 and that was not how 9 worked. Victoria appeared at their table a few minutes later, not with coffee or a check, just herself. She stood at the edge of the booth and looked at Cole with the clear, direct look that he'd noticed about her from the beginning. She didn't look at people sideways or manage her eye contact the way some people did when they were performing a version of sincerity. She just looked. "Hey," she said. "Hey, you doing okay?" "I'm fine." He meant it. The exchange with Hargrove had cost him nothing he hadn't been willing to spend. "You?" She exhaled. It was a short sound, compressed, carrying more than it released. "I've had better Fridays." "Has that happened before? Someone like that?" She looked past him, briefly, toward the door. "Not exactly like that, but variations." She brought her eyes back. "Usually I just absorb it and move on. It's part of—" She stopped. Started again. "It's something you learn to manage. You shouldn't have to manage it." "No," she agreed. "But you manage a lot of things you shouldn't have to." She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. That's just how it goes sometimes. Ava had looked up from her drawing and was watching Victoria with an expression of open, unguarded assessment that children could get away with in ways adults couldn't. "Your wrist okay?" Ava asked. Victoria looked at her, and the tight professional surface she'd been maintaining for the last half hour softened in a way that seemed involuntary, the way faces do when a child asks something direct enough to bypass all the constructed layers. "It's fine, sweetheart. Thank you for asking." "My dad's hand is really strong," Ava offered, as though this were relevant context. "Like, really strong. He once opened a pickle jar that my grandma had given up on." Victoria's mouth moved into something that was almost a full smile. "Good to know." "I'm just saying, if that man had tried anything else—" "Ava," Cole said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Eat your dinner." Ava returned to her grilled cheese with the dignity of someone who has made their point and is willing to let it stand without elaboration. Victoria watched her for a moment, and whatever was on her face in that moment was complicated and private, and Cole didn't try to name it. "Thank you," Victoria said, looking back at Cole, "for all of that. You didn't have to." "I know. A lot of people just looked away." "I know that too." She nodded once, a small, precise movement. "I'm going to remember that you didn't." She said it simply, without decoration. Then she picked up his nearly empty coffee mug. "Let me get you a refill. On the house." She walked back toward the counter, and Cole watched her go with the feeling that there was more to Victoria Sinclair than a Friday night in a diner revealed, though he hadn't spent much time thinking about why that was until now. The evening had settled. The diner continued its Friday rhythms, tables clearing, new people coming in shaking rain off their jackets, the counter filling up with the later crowd that came in after 9 with the loose, unhurried energy of people who had nowhere specific to be. Bobby's food kept coming through the service window with the dependable regularity of a man who took his work seriously, even if he refused to discuss it. Cole finished his meatloaf. Ava finished her grilled cheese and negotiated unsuccessfully for a piece of the chocolate cream pie she'd seen going past on a plate, and then negotiated again, slightly more successfully, for a smaller piece than the one she'd originally requested. He had it put in a box because it was getting close to 9, and she had a soccer game in the morning, and the pie-in-the-box compromise seemed to satisfy some internal justice system she was running. He was reaching for his wallet when the door opened again. The bell rang. The same bell, the same clear light sound, and Cole registered it the way he registered everything, that background attention that didn't require any decision-making. He expected the late crowd. He expected someone shaking rain off a jacket. He did not expect the woman who walked in. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of bearing that didn't announce itself loudly, but made itself felt within seconds of entering a room. The straightness of her posture, the economy of her movements, the way she scanned the diner quickly and completely without appearing to do so. She was wearing a dark coat, good quality, and her silver hair was cut short and precise. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of face that had never been conventionally beautiful but had become something better over time. Specific, authoritative, lived in. She spotted Victoria behind the counter and moved toward her with the directness of someone who did not make the social mistake of hesitating when they knew where they were going. Cole put his wallet back. He wasn't sure why, just instinct. The evening, which had seemed finished, felt like it wasn't. The woman reached the counter and said something to Victoria in a low voice. Cole was 3 booths away and the ambient noise of the room covered it, but he watched Victoria's face, and whatever the woman said produced a reaction that was more complicated than surprise. Victoria's expression moved through several things quickly: recognition, confusion, something that might have been the specific discomfort of being seen somewhere you'd chosen not to be seen. Victoria said something back. The woman shook her head, gently but definitively. Then Victoria looked across the room and found Cole's eyes, and held them for a half-second in a way that felt like a door opening, or maybe a door about to open, something on the verge of a different kind of visibility than the evening had already offered. The woman at the counter turned and looked at Cole too. She assessed him in the same quick, complete way she'd scanned the diner's shin, no wasted motion, no performance. And then she said something else to Victoria. Victoria set down the rag she'd been holding and came around the counter. They walked together toward Cole's booth. The woman slightly ahead, Victoria slightly behind and to the left, which told Cole something about the dynamic between them, though he couldn't name it precisely yet. "Mr. Maddox," Victoria said when they reached the booth, and hearing her use his last name was unexpected enough that Ava looked up from the pie box she'd been examining. "Cole is fine," he said. Victoria nodded. She was holding herself differently than she had been earlier. Not worse, not more tense, but more guarded, in the specific way of someone who is about to be exposed to something they'd kept separate by choice. "This is Margaret Holloway," Victoria said. She paused. "An old friend." Margaret Holloway extended her hand to Cole and he shook it. Her grip was firm in the specific, uncalculated way of someone who had been shaking hands for decades and had long since stopped thinking about what it communicated. "I heard there was some trouble tonight," Margaret said. She had a voice like a courtroom, clear, unhurried, accustomed to being the last sound in a room. "There was some," Cole said. "It's handled." "So I've been told." She looked at him steadily. "You spoke to Wallace Hargrove." "I don't know his name. Man in an expensive suit." "That's him." She glanced at Ava, who was watching her with the same focused attention she'd given the entire evening. "He's a business associate of a firm that Victoria has been—" She stopped, looked at Victoria, who gave a small, barely perceptible shake of her head. Margaret adjusted. "He's someone Victoria has had dealings with professionally. The nature of those dealings is—" Another pause, this one chosen rather than accidental. "More complicated than tonight suggested." Cole looked at Victoria. "Okay." Victoria sat down across from him, in the seat Ava had vacated to sit next to her father. Margaret remained standing, which seemed to be her natural state. "I work here on weekends," Victoria said, without preamble. "I have for about 8 months. Nobody here knows—" She stopped, started over. "I didn't tell anyone who I was. I just applied and worked. Bobby knows me as Vicky. The other regulars know me as the Friday-Saturday waitress. You know me as Victoria because that's my actual name and I couldn't think of a reason to use a different one." Cole waited. "During the week," she said carefully, "I do something else." He looked at her, the way she'd read the room when they'd entered, the way she'd managed 3 sections without appearing rushed, the way she'd absorbed Hargrove's contempt without fracturing, not because she was used to being treated badly, but because she was practiced at staying composed under pressure. "What do you do during the week?" he asked. Victoria laced her fingers together on the table, a gesture that was more self-containing than nervous. "I run a company," she said. Ava looked up from the pie box. "What kind of company?" Cole asked. "Investment and asset management. We have about 400 employees across 3 offices." She said it the way someone says something they've decided to stop being careful about, flatly, without softening. "We cleared about $900 million in managed assets last quarter." The number sat on the table between them. Ava looked at Cole. He kept his eyes on Victoria. "Why are you here?" he said. Not accusatory, just the actual question. Victoria unfolded her hands and looked at them for a moment. Because I was losing the thread, she said. 3 years ago, I was making decisions that affected hundreds of people, employees, clients, their families, and I realized I was making them from inside a world that had almost no contact with the way most people actually live. Not out of malice, just distance, the kind that accumulates so gradually you don't notice until it's thick. She paused. Outside, a car went past with its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. My mentor, a woman I worked under early in my career, she told me once that the most dangerous thing that happens to people in positions of authority isn't corruption. It's insulation. You stop being accountable to the reality of ordinary life and you start mistaking your bubble for the world. She glanced at Margaret, who was listening with the expression of someone who has heard this before and finds it no less true for that. So I came here. Once a week, then twice a week. I take orders. I carry plates. I manage tables during a dinner rush. I get tired in my feet, and I deal with difficult people, and I remember what it costs to stay professional when someone treats you like furniture. And Hargrove, Cole said. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. He's been trying to arrange a meeting for 6 weeks. I've declined 4 times through my assistant. He's the kind of man who believes that persistence is a form of power and that eventually everyone folds. She looked toward the door, though Hargrove was long gone. He didn't recognize me tonight. I look different here. No one who knows me professionally has ever seen me in this uniform. She looked back at Cole. When he walked in, I thought about leaving. I almost clocked out early. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment. Because leaving felt like letting him determine the shape of my night. And I'm very tired of men like that determining the shape of things. The diner hummed around them. Dishes from the kitchen, a low conversation at the counter, the muted television still throwing its changing light across the ceiling. Margaret had moved to lean against the empty booth beside them, with the patience of someone who understood that this conversation needed to finish on its own schedule. Cole thought about what Victoria had said. He turned it over in the way he turned most things. Not quickly, not with the kind of efficient processing that looks like intelligence, but slowly, looking at it from different angles, checking what held and what didn't. You could have said something, he said, to Hargrove, when he was going after you. You could have told him who you were. Yes, Victoria said. But you didn't? No. Why? She looked at him directly. Because it shouldn't matter, she said. What I am on a Tuesday in a boardroom shouldn't change how I'm treated on a Friday in a diner. If the only reason he would have stopped is because I turned out to be worth something to him, then stopping wasn't about decency. It was about math. She shook her head. I didn't want that. I didn't want to be protected by my title. I wanted him to stop because it was right to stop. Cole nodded slowly. From beside him, Ava's voice came quietly, carefully, with the particular tone she used when she'd been thinking something for a while and had finally decided to say it. That's why it mattered that my dad didn't know either, she said. Both women looked at her. Ava was looking at Victoria with those wide, dark eyes, completely steady. He didn't know anything about you except that it was wrong. He didn't know you were a CEO or whatever. He just knew it was wrong. She glanced at Cole, then back. That's what makes it the real thing, right? The table was quiet. Victoria looked at Ava for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just heard something put more clearly than they could have put it themselves. It was a look that held something complicated. Recognition, maybe, and a kind of gratitude that was different from the gratitude she'd expressed to Cole. More surprised, less expected. Yeah, Victoria said. Her voice had changed slightly, gone softer at the edges. That's exactly what makes it the real thing. Margaret made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a word, more an acknowledgement, the sound of someone hearing something they'll repeat later in a different room. Cole looked at his daughter for a moment. She had already gone back to inspecting the pie box, apparently satisfied that her point had been made and required no further advocacy. He'd spent 9 years being caught off guard by her, and he was still not used to it, and he suspected he never would be. He looked at Victoria. Does Hargrove know who you are? Now? Did Margaret tell him? No, Margaret said from her position against the booth. He left before I arrived. Will he find out? Eventually, Victoria said. People like Hargrove usually do. His assistant will research the diner, cross-reference the staff, run the name. It'll take him a few days, maybe less. She said it without apparent anxiety. When he does, I imagine he'll be very uncomfortable. Good, Ava said, without looking up from the pie box. Victoria laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that gets surprised out of you rather than offered. It changed her face completely. It took 10 years off it and replaced whatever professional composure she'd been maintaining with something more unmediated and true. Cole had the thought, quick and unasked for, that she laughed like someone who didn't do it enough. He let the thought pass. What happens now? He said. Not about Hargrove specifically, just the question that was actually in the room. Victoria looked around the diner. At Bobby's service window, at the counter, at the tables she'd been working all night. The ordinary geography of a place she'd chosen to come back to, again and again, for reasons that had made sense to her before they made sense to anyone else. I finished my shift, she said. There was something decided in it, something settled. Same as any other Friday. Margaret made a small noise that might have been approval. Victoria looked at Cole one more time. And then I go home and think about the fact that tonight a man I've never met stood up in a room full of people and said, without being asked, that what was happening was wrong. She paused. I'm going to carry that into some rooms where it's going to matter a great deal. I want you to know that. Cole didn't know what to say to that, so he said the honest thing, which was nothing. He just nodded, once, and she took it for what it was. She stood, straightened her apron. Margaret pushed off from the booth with the efficiency of someone who has accomplished what she came to do. Your check's covered, Victoria said. Both of you. You don't have to. I know. She picked up his empty coffee mug from the table. That's the point. She walked back toward the counter, and Margaret followed, and Cole sat in the red vinyl booth in the diner that smelled like coffee and butter and something faintly sweet, and he listened to Ava tear a small corner off the pie box to assess the chocolate cream inside. And he didn't say anything for a while. He was thinking about rooms, the ones he'd been in that changed everything, and the ones that changed nothing, and the ones where the difference came down to a single person deciding not to look away. He was thinking about the fact that he still didn't know, not really, what had made him stand up tonight. Not the calculation of it, not the moral architecture, just the raw mechanical fact of why his body had moved when everyone else's hadn't. He didn't have a clean answer. He wasn't sure there was one. Some things you did before you understood why, and the understanding came later, or it didn't come, and either way the thing was done. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The street was wet and reflective and quiet, catching the light of the lampposts and breaking it into something softer than it was. Ava put the lid back on the pie box and looked at him. Can we come back next Friday? She asked. He looked at her, at the pie box, at the diner around them, unchanged and ordinary and somehow different than it had been 2 hours ago. Yeah, he said, we can come back next Friday. He drove home the long way, not because the long way was faster or more practical. It added 6 minutes and took them past the industrial stretch of Delwood where the old textile warehouse sat abandoned behind a chain-link fence. But because Ava was quiet in the passenger seat with the pie box on her lap and the window slightly cracked despite the damp air, and Cole had learned over 9 years that when Ava went quiet after something significant, the quiet needed room to finish itself before it was ready to become conversation. The radio was off. The heater ran low. The wet streets caught their headlights and threw them back in long, broken streaks of yellow and white. He was about 4 blocks from home when Ava said, without any particular lead-up, "Do you think she's happy?" "Who?" "Victoria." He considered this. "I think she's complicated," he said. Ava turned that over. "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "But it's the honest one." She accepted this without argument, which was how he knew it had satisfied something in her. She looked back out the window. A block later, she said, "I think she's lonely," and then didn't elaborate, and Cole didn't push it, and they drove the last 3 blocks home in the specific, easy quiet of 2 people who have spent enough time together that silence between them doesn't need to be filled. He got her to bed at 10:15, which was 40 minutes later than it should have been on a night before a soccer game, but was close enough to acceptable that he let it go without a negotiation. She took the pie box with her to her room, which he pretended not to notice, and when he checked on her 20 minutes later, she was asleep with the box on her nightstand, still closed, as if having it nearby was the point rather than eating it. He stood in her doorway for a moment the way he did most nights. Not for any reason, just habit, the need to confirm with his own eyes that she was there and safe and breathing, and that the world had not found a way to take anything else from him while he wasn't looking. Then he went downstairs, poured himself a glass of water he didn't particularly want, and sat at the kitchen table. He was not a man who processed things extensively or spent long hours examining his own decisions. That kind of internal accounting had been drilled out of him early, and what the military hadn't finished, grief had completed. You made the call you made with the information you had, and you moved forward, and you didn't pick it apart unless picking it apart taught you something useful for next time. But tonight sat differently. Not wrong. Nothing about it felt wrong. Just different in a way he was still finding the shape of. He thought about Victoria's face when she'd told him about the company. Not the content of it, not the number she'd said, but the way she'd said it, the deliberate flatness of it, the active removal of apology or qualification, like she was handing him something and watching to see if he'd drop it. He hadn't dropped it. He wasn't sure what he'd done with it, actually. He'd just taken it in and let it sit where it landed. He finished the water he didn't want and went to bed. The soccer game the next morning was at 8:30, which meant they were up at 7 and out the door at 7:40 with Ava's cleats in a bag and a granola bar she was eating in the car because there hadn't been time for anything else. Cole drove and drank gas station coffee from a cup that was too hot and burned his thumb when the lid shifted and said nothing about it. Ava's team was called the Delwood Fire, which was the kind of name chosen by a committee of adults trying to inspire 9-year-olds and resulting in something that inspired mostly mild embarrassment among the 9-year-olds themselves, though they'd never said so to the adults. They played in orange and red, which Cole privately thought was a lot of color for 8 in the morning. He stood on the sideline with the other parents in the thin October sun that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be warm and watched Ava run. She was good. Not prodigy good, but real good. The kind of good that came from paying attention and caring about doing it right, rather than from any particular physical gift. She had good instincts on the field, read the play before it developed, which was the thing you couldn't coach. Her mother had been the same way. On a soccer field, in a room full of people, in any situation that required reading what was actually happening beneath what appeared to be happening. She'd had a gift for the subsurface of things. He pushed that away before it went further and watched Ava intercept a pass near midfield and drive it upfield with a focus that made her look, just for a moment, like someone twice her age. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. He checked it. Unknown number. A text message. "This is Victoria Sinclair. I got your number from Margaret, who got it from the diner's reservation log. You made a reservation once, about a year ago, and your number was in the system. I'm sorry if this is strange. I wanted to say something I didn't say well last night." He read it twice, looked up at the field. Ava's team had scored, and she was doing the specific restrained celebration of someone who wanted to be excited but also wanted to appear professional about it, pumping one fist twice and then immediately getting back into position. He looked back at the phone. "What didn't you say well?" he typed back. The reply took about 3 minutes. "I said thank you, but I said it like it was a transaction, like you did something and I was acknowledging it and we were square. That's not what I meant. What I meant was that I've been doing this, the diner, the weekends, for 8 months, and in 8 months nobody has ever done what you did last night. Not because bad things haven't happened, because people look away. They always look away. And I've told myself that's fine, that's human, that's just how things work. And then last night you didn't, and it messed up my whole theory." Cole read this standing on the sideline of a youth soccer game with gas station coffee going cold in his hand. The morning was bright and specific around him. The sound of kids running, a parent shouting encouragement from the far side of the field, the smell of wet grass from the overnight rain still coming up off the ground. He typed back, "Your theory wasn't wrong. Most people do look away." I almost did. This time the reply was faster. But you didn't. No. Why not? He thought about what he'd told Ava the night before, when she'd asked him the same thing in a different form. The honest answer was still the honest answer. I don't have a clean reason. My daughter was watching. I've been in situations before where somebody should have stepped in and didn't. Combination of things. A longer pause this time, long enough that he wondered if that was the end of it. Then, the man whose wrist I wasn't holding said that true strength is about protecting people. His name was Cole Maddox. He works maintenance and has a 9-year-old daughter, and he eats meatloaf on Fridays. That's all I know about him. But I'm going to quote him in a speech I'm giving to 400 people on Wednesday, and he's not going to know that, which seemed unfair. So now you know. Cole stared at his phone for a moment. Then he looked up at the field, where Ava had just won a header that sent the ball sailing toward the opposing goal, and the sideline erupted in the particular way of parents who have been waiting for exactly this moment. He clapped. He put his phone back in his pocket. He didn't answer the message, not right then. He spent the rest of the game on the sideline watching his daughter run in orange and red. And he thought about what it meant to be quoted by someone who had 8 months of evenings in a diner trying to stay connected to the way things actually were, and decided that he didn't entirely know what it meant, but that it didn't make him uncomfortable, which was its own kind of answer. Delwood Fire won, 3-1. Ava scored once and assisted once and was deeply modest about both in the car home, which lasted approximately 4 minutes before she gave him a play-by-play account of every significant moment in the game from her perspective, which was detailed and occasionally contradicted what Cole had observed from the sideline, but which he didn't interrupt because listening to her was one of the things he was most grateful to be alive to do. He answered Victoria's message that afternoon while Ava was doing homework at the kitchen table, and he was making lunch. For the record, I didn't say that about strength. My daughter figured it out. She's 9. Might want to update your attribution. Victoria's reply came while he was slicing bread. Your daughter sounds like someone I'd like to meet properly. She'd have opinions about how you run your company. I have people who are paid significantly to have opinions about how I run my company. They're less useful than you'd think. He set the knife down. This was the part where, in a different version of his life, a version with less scar tissue and more bandwidth for things that were uncertain, he might have done something about the fact that he was smiling at his phone in his kitchen on a Saturday afternoon. In this version, he put the phone in his pocket and made 2 sandwiches and called Ava to lunch and let it sit without deciding anything about it. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that weeks sometimes are after extraordinary things. Same pipes, same spreadsheets, same crew meetings, same school pickup, same bedtime arguments about screen time. Wednesday came and went. He thought once, briefly, about Victoria standing in front of 400 people, and then he thought about a burst pipe on the 3rd floor of a pharmaceutical distribution center that was his actual problem on Wednesday, and he let the thought go. Friday arrived the way Fridays did. With a kind of low gravitational pull he'd stopped fighting after the first month of their routine, the week bending naturally toward the evening and the diner and the red vinyl booths and the coffee that Victoria poured without being asked. He almost suggested somewhere different, told himself it was because Ava might like a change, that they'd been going to Patty's Corner for 2 years, and maybe the Thai place on Hendricks Avenue that Ava had been requesting for 3 weeks deserved a chance. He did not suggest somewhere different. They arrived at 6:40, later than usual because Ava's reading group had run long. The rain had come back, softer than the previous Friday, more of a mist that collected on your jacket rather than fell on it. The neon sign above the entrance was doing its usual pink trembling across the puddles. The diner was busy, more so than typical for a Friday. An extra table pushed in near the back to accommodate a birthday party that was just getting started, balloons tied to a chair, a child somewhere under 8 wearing a paper crown. Victoria was working 2 sections when they walked in. She saw them from across the room, and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatic, not performed, just a small private acknowledgement, the kind that passes between 2 people who have something between them that doesn't have a name yet. She came over in a few minutes with coffee and a Sprite, same as always. "Hey, Trouble," she said to Ava. "Hey," Ava said. "We won our game." "I heard." Ava's eyes went wide. "How?" Victoria set down the Sprite. "A little bird." Ava looked at Cole with the specific outrage of someone whose private victories have been shared without permission. He held up both hands. Your dad may have texted, Victoria said, and the look she gave Cole over the top of Ava's head carried something obsessive and slightly knowing, and he decided not to examine it too closely. One assist and a goal, Ava said, recovering her dignity rapidly, in case the little bird left that part out. One assist and a goal, Victoria confirmed seriously. It was in the report. She took their order and moved back through the tables with that same efficiency Cole had noted the first night. The reading of a room, the management of competing demands, the invisible architecture of service that looked effortless because it had been practiced into fluency. He watched her work. He'd watched her work 100 Friday nights, and he was watching differently now, and he was aware of watching differently, and he didn't make anything of it except to file it as true. The birthday party in the back reached whatever moment birthday parties reach, when the sugar and the noise converge, a high, joyful chaos that briefly drowned out everything else in the diner before settling back into its particular pitch. The child with the paper crown was laughing with the full physical abandonment that children have, and adults spend years trying to recover access to. Ava was watching them with a complicated expression. What? Cole said. Nothing. She picked up her Sprite. Just thinking. About what? She shrugged. Not the shrug that meant she didn't want to say, the shrug that meant she was still working out how to say it. He waited. At Maya's last birthday, she said carefully, her parents were already fighting, but they pretended not to be. For the party, she pulled the wrapper off her straw. I remember thinking it was weird that everyone was pretending, and everyone knew everyone was pretending, and nobody said anything. She pushed the straw into her Sprite, like the pretending was the whole thing, not the birthday. Cole looked at his daughter. That happens a lot, he said, after a moment. People pretend things are fine when they're not, because saying they're not feels like it makes them more not fine. Does it, though? Actually make it worse? Sometimes. Sometimes it just makes it lonelier. Ava absorbed this. I think lonely is worse than not fine. Yeah, Cole said. I think so too. She nodded, satisfied, and looked back at the birthday party. The child in the crown was now attempting to blow out candles on a cake being carried in from the kitchen, surrounded by adults leaning in with the collaborative focus of people trying to make a moment matter. They managed it. The candles went out and the room applauded. Spontaneously, warmly, the way people sometimes do when something small and complete happens nearby. And the child with the crown shrieked with the specific happiness of someone for whom this moment was the entire world. Ava clapped. Cole clapped. From 3 tables over, a man Cole didn't know started singing Happy Birthday, and half the diner joined in, ragged and off-key and completely genuine. Victoria appeared at his elbow at the tail end of the singing, setting down his meatloaf with the particular smile of someone who loves a room when it forgets to be self-conscious. Bobby actually put rosemary in it this week, she said. Don't tell him I told you. He's very mysterious about it. Your secret, Cole said. She looked at him for a beat longer than the exchange required. Then she said, I meant what I said in the text about Wednesday. I know you did. It went well, the speech. She straightened the sugar caddy that didn't need straightening. I told them. I didn't use your name, but I told them about a man I'd watched stand up in a room full of people who decided looking away was easier. I told them that the most important thing I'd learned in 8 months of working weekends in a diner was that character is just what you do when the stakes feel too low to bother. She looked up from the sugar caddy. 3 people came up to me afterward, said it was the only part of the whole speech they were going to remember. Cole looked at his plate. I didn't do anything that unusual. That's exactly what makes it unusual, she said. And she said it without drama, without trying to make the moment bigger than it was, just as a plain statement of something she'd concluded. She moved on to the next table. Cole ate his meatloaf, which did have something different in it, herb-forward, warmer, the kind of small improvement that came from someone who'd been making the same thing for years and was still paying attention. He was nearly finished when his phone buzzed. Not a text this time, a call, and the number was one he recognized, his crew lead, Danny, which on a Friday night meant something had gone sideways somewhere. He picked up. What's wrong? Sorry, Cole, I know it's Friday. Danny's voice had the particular texture of someone standing near something loud. The Hendricks Avenue property. Sprinkler system triggered in the east stairwell. We don't know why yet. Building manager is losing his mind. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. Ava was already reading his expression. We have to go? She said. I have to go. I'm going to call Mrs. Petrakis. She's in Florida. He stopped. He'd forgotten. Mrs. Petrakis, their neighbor and Ava's occasional emergency option, had mentioned Florida last week and he'd filed it and apparently filed it badly. Okay, he thought for 3 seconds. You can come to the site, stay in the truck. Dad? Ava gave him the look. I'm 9, not 5. I can sit at a diner for an hour. He looked at her, looked at the diner around them, the birthday party still going in the back, the counter crowd in their comfortable late Friday orbit, Bobby visible through the service window with the dependable solidity of a man who had been in that kitchen since before Cole had moved to Delwood. He looked for Victoria and found her across the room, taking an order from the birthday table with a patience that suggested she had been asked a complicated customization question 3 times in a row. He caught her eye. She came over when she could, 2 minutes later, and he explained quickly. The work call, the neighbor being out of town. Would it be possible? Leave her, Victoria said before he'd finished the sentence. I've got her. Bobby's here all night. The place is full. She's fine. I don't want to... Cole. She said his name with a directness that closed the argument before it developed. Go fix the pipe. He looked at Ava. Ava was already moving his plate aside to make room for her drawing materials, apparently having decided the logistics were handled. Don't give Victoria trouble, he said. I never give anyone trouble, Ava said, which was not even slightly true, and all 3 of them knew it. He put 2 20s on the table, grabbed his jacket, and paused at the booth's edge. He looked at Victoria, who was watching him with a steady expression that was difficult to interpret and that he was beginning to think was intentionally difficult to interpret. Thank you, he said. 3rd time you've said that to me, she said, starting to notice a pattern. I'll stop when it stops being true. She tilted her head, and something moved across her face that might have been a smile starting and then deciding to stay private. Go, she said. 45 minutes. The place closes around us, and I'll call you. He went. The Hendricks Avenue job took 58 minutes and a waterlogged ceiling tile that came down in his hands when he reached for it and covered the front of his jacket in something he chose not to examine closely. Danny had the issue isolated by the time Cole arrived. A faulty trigger valve, corroded, which meant it hadn't been the water causing the problem, but the mechanism meant to control the water, which was its own category of irony. They got it stabilized, got the building manager calmed down from the register of someone who thought the building was going to fall, and into the register of someone who understood it was just going to need a new valve and some drywall, which was bad, but survivable. Cole drove back to the diner with ceiling tile residue on his jacket and the specific tiredness that came from solving a problem under pressure, which was different from the tiredness of a long, ordinary day, cleaner somehow, more resolved. He pushed open the diner door at 8:47. The birthday party had cleared out. The late crowd had thinned. The pink neon outside had started doing the flicker it did toward the end of the night when the transformer was cooling. Ava was in the booth. Across from her, in the seat Cole had been sitting in earlier, was Victoria, still in her apron, a cup of coffee in front of her, her hair slightly loosened from the pull it had been in all night. She was leaning forward on her forearms, looking at something Ava had spread across the table between them. A drawing. Several drawings, actually. The napkin drawings from earlier in the evening and a few more on the paper placemat. They were talking. Not the way an adult talks to a child to be polite about it, but the way 2 people talk when they've found a subject that interests both of them equally. Ava's hands were moving, explaining something about one of the drawings, and Victoria was nodding with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than performing interest. Cole stood in the doorway for a moment. He was not a man given to reading too much into things. He had burned that tendency out of himself in the years after losing his wife, cauterized the part that kept trying to make meaning from ordinary moments because making meaning from ordinary moments had become too painful when the ordinary moments were all he had left of her. But he stood in the doorway of Patty's Corner Diner on a wet Friday night and looked at his daughter and the woman across from her, and he let himself see it for what it was without turning it into anything more. Just two people who had found each other's company unexpectedly good, across a table covered in drawings of horses, in a diner that smelled like coffee and had a neon sign that flickered when it was tired. Ava looked up and saw him. Her face opened in the way it did when he'd been gone long enough that his return was a relief she hadn't entirely admitted to herself. "You have something on your jacket," she said. "I know." "What is it?" "Ceiling tile." "That's disgusting." "A little bit," he agreed. Victoria looked up at him from across the table. Her expression was different from the one she'd been wearing earlier. Less managed, looser, the professional surface she maintained through a shift worn down to something more actual by the late hour and the conversation she'd been in. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Handled?" He sat down in the booth beside Ava and looked at the drawings spread between them. "What are we looking at?" Ava was explaining her process, Victoria said. Her process. For the horses. Apparently there's a specific order. The eyes first, then the mane, then the body. Eyes first, Ava confirmed, with the authority of someone who has developed a philosophy. Because the eyes are the part that makes them real. Everything else you can fix. You can't fix the eyes if you get them wrong. Cole looked at his daughter, then at Victoria, who was looking at Ava with the expression of someone hearing something simple that has turned out to be about more than horses. "That's true of most things," Victoria said quietly. She wasn't talking about drawing anymore, and all three of them knew it. Ava looked pleased. In the private way she got pleased when an adult took something she'd said seriously rather than translating it into something easier. She started gathering her drawings, rolling the napkins carefully. The diner had gone quiet around them. Bobby had dimmed the kitchen lights, the signal that the night was winding down. The counter was empty. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street, its taillights pulling two red lines through the dark. Victoria picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down without refilling it. She looked tired in a way she hadn't been hiding from for the last few minutes. Real tired, the kind that had accumulated through a long week and a longer shift, and an evening that had asked more of her than a Friday night was supposed to. "I should close out my tables," she said, but didn't move immediately. "Yeah," Cole said. A pause. "The drawings," Victoria said to Ava. "The one with the fence, can I—" She stopped. "Never mind. That's a weird thing to ask." "You can have it," Ava said immediately. She pulled the napkin with the fence drawing from her collection and held it out across the table. "I was going to throw it away anyway." "You weren't." "No," Ava admitted. "But you can still have it." Victoria took it. She looked at it for a moment. The horse, the fence, the careful ink lines of a 9-year-old who had learned to do the eyes first, because the eyes were the part that made it real. She folded it once, carefully, and put it in the pocket of her apron. "Thank you, Ava," she said, and the way she said the name, like she meant to keep it, like it was something she was placing carefully, made Cole look at the table for a moment to give her the privacy of the expression on her face. Victoria closed out her last table at 9:22. Cole knew the exact time because he was watching the clock above the register. Not anxiously, not for any particular reason, just the way he watched things. The background inventory of a man whose training had made timekeeping as automatic as breathing. Ava had fallen asleep in the booth beside him somewhere around 9, her head against his shoulder, her drawing materials tucked back into her backpack with the careful organization she applied to the things she cared about. The pie box was on the seat beside her. She'd gotten through half of it at some point during the 58 minutes he'd been at the Hendricks Avenue job, and had said nothing about it, which meant she thought the information was better for him not to have. He didn't mention it. Some hills weren't worth the fight, and tonight especially he didn't have the energy to locate the hill, let alone climb it. Bobby came out of the kitchen at 9:30 with his jacket on and a set of keys in his hand and the expression of a man who had been on his feet since noon and had made peace with that fact but was ready for it to be over. He nodded at Cole on his way to the door, the specific nod of one working man to another, a nod that contained an entire conversation about long days and not needing to explain them. "She's locking up," Bobby said, tilting his head toward the back. "Won't be long." "Thanks, Bobby." Bobby pushed open the door and the damp night air came in briefly before the door swung shut behind him. And then it was just Cole and the sleeping Ava and the quiet diner and the sound of Victoria moving through the back. The clatter of a final few things being put away. The specific sounds of a place being closed down by someone who knew every step of the routine by heart. He wasn't sure when he'd decided to wait. He hadn't made a conscious decision. He'd just still been there when Bobby put on his jacket, and the path of least resistance had been continuing to be there, which was either the most natural thing in the world or the most deliberate thing he'd done in a long time, and he genuinely could not tell the difference. Victoria came out from the back at 9:38 with her regular clothes on, dark jeans, a gray sweater, her hair down for the first time he'd ever seen it. She was carrying a tote bag and her keys were already in her hand. She stopped when she saw him, not in a startled way, but in the way of someone who had thought they might find something and was now confirming that they had. "You're still here," she said. Ava fell asleep. Victoria looked at Ava, then back at him, and didn't say anything about whether that was the reason or just the reason he'd offered. "I'm going to be parked in next week," she said. "Someone's going to recognize me eventually. Margaret thinks it's already happening. One of the line cooks apparently said something to Bobby last week about having seen my photo somewhere." "What will you do?" She looked around the diner, not with the survey of someone cataloging assets or resources, with the look of someone taking in a place they know is about to change. The cracked vinyl booths, the off-white tiles, the television above the register that was off now, just a dark rectangle in the wall, the pie shelf with 2 pieces of cherry left under their glass dome. "Keep coming," she said, "as long as I can. And when it stops being possible to come here, I'll figure out how to carry what I got here somewhere else." She pulled her jacket off the hook near the door. There was a row of them, staff hooks, and hers was the last one with anything on it. It's not the diner that matters. It was never really about the diner. What was it about? She pulled the jacket on and looked at him. "Staying honest," she said, "about what things cost, about what work actually looks like, about what people are dealing with when they sit down at a table and they're tired and they just need someone to bring them what they asked for without making it complicated." She zipped the jacket halfway. "I make decisions that affect a lot of people's livelihoods. I think I owe them someone who hasn't forgotten what a long week feels like in your body, not just in a quarterly report." Cole looked at her. The diner light was low now. Half the overheads were off, just the counter strip and the pennant above the register still on, throwing a warm, narrow light that made everything look like it was close to something rather than at the end of it. "You'd have figured that out anyway," he said, "without the diner." "Maybe." She picked up her tote bag. "But I wasn't. That's the thing. I was smart about it. I was thoughtful about it. I could have given you a very articulate presentation about the importance of staying grounded, and I was still losing it. Slowly, in ways I wouldn't have noticed until they were large." She looked at him steadily. "Sometimes the thing you know you should do and the thing you actually do are very different things. The diner made me actually do it." He thought about that. He thought about the gap between knowing and doing, which he had personal experience of in a different register. The years after losing his wife, when he'd known, intellectually, completely, that grief was not permanent, that the weight of it would shift, that Ava needed him present and not just physically located. He'd known all of it. Knowing had not been the hard part. The hard part had been the distance between knowing and the morning he woke up, and the first thought he had was not loss but coffee, and whether Ava's cleats were dry from the day before. That morning had taken 3 years to arrive. "Yeah," he said, "I know something about that." She looked at him with the expression she'd worn across the table earlier, the one that was hard to interpret and that he'd decided she was choosing carefully, using it as a kind of door that was slightly open without being an invitation. "I know you do," she said, and she said it like she meant more than the last 30 seconds of conversation, like she meant the whole of what she'd seen in him over the course of an ordinary Friday that had turned into something else. And he let that sit without deflecting it, which was harder than it might have appeared. Ava stirred, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and shifted her weight against Cole's shoulder and then resettled without waking. "I should get her home," Cole said. "You should." He didn't move right away. Neither did she. Outside the window, the street was empty and wet and quiet, the lampposts doing their ordinary work, the pink neon of the sign above the entrance still trembling its reflection in the puddles on the sidewalk. The drawing, he said. That she gave you. Victoria's hand went briefly to the pocket of her jeans. She'd transferred it from the apron, he registered. What about it? She doesn't give those away, he said. Usually. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I figured, she said. I almost didn't ask. I know, but you did. She looked at him directly. It felt important to ask. He nodded. There wasn't anything to add to that. It was either true or it wasn't, and she'd said it plainly enough that adding to it would only dilute it. He shifted carefully, the practiced movement of a man who had extracted himself from under a sleeping child many times without waking her, getting to his feet and gathering Ava against his shoulder in one slow motion. Ava made the sound again, adjusted, and went back under. She weighed more than she used to. They always did, Cole had found, when they were asleep. Like sleep added something to them, some density that wasn't there when they were awake and moving through the world at their usual velocity. He picked up her backpack with his free hand and hooked it over his other shoulder. The pie box he left, then thought about it and picked it up too, tucking it under the hand that held the backpack. He was not a graceful picture. He knew that. Victoria held the door. The night air was cold and clean and smelled like wet pavement and somewhere distant wood smoke. The parking lot was down to 3 cars. His truck, a compact that must have been Victoria's, and an older sedan that probably belonged to whoever handled the overnight delivery. He got Ava settled into the passenger seat without waking her, a minor operational success that he took quiet satisfaction in, and buckled her seatbelt and put the pie box on the back seat and stood up and turned around. Victoria was standing a few feet away with her keys in her hand, not leaning on anything, just standing in the specific way of someone who has something they're deciding whether to say. He waited. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know that it's okay to say no. I mean that as a factual statement, not a preamble. Okay. I have an event, 3 weeks from now. Annual dinner, company thing, 400 people, the full production. She said it with a neutrality that suggested she had complicated feelings about it, that she was not going to perform for him. It's the kind of event where the food is better than tonight's, but the company is considerably worse. Mostly people who want something from me professionally and are willing to eat rubber chicken to get proximity to the ask. She paused. I would like to go with someone who has no idea what anything in that room costs and doesn't care, and who will tell me honestly if I start sounding like someone who's forgotten what they learned in 8 months of Friday nights. Cole looked at her. She looked back. That's a complicated way to ask someone to dinner, he said. I'm a complicated person. I've noticed. Is that a yes or a no? He thought about it for 3 genuine seconds. Not performing consideration, actually considering. The variables were clear enough. A 9-year-old with a soccer schedule and homework and a social ecosystem that required his involvement. Work. The particular emotional arithmetic of being a widower who had not done anything like this in 4 years and was not entirely sure his instincts in that territory were calibrated correctly anymore. Against all of that, the fact that he was standing in a parking lot at 9:45 on a Friday night and not wanting to leave it. Yes, he said. Something in her expression changed, not dramatically, not with the physical openness of relief or happiness that he might have expected, but in the quieter way of something settling, like a door that had been resting against its frame, finding the latch. Okay, she said. Okay. A beat. I'll need your actual number, he said. Margaret going through the reservation log is a little much. Victoria laughed, the same laugh as earlier, sudden and unguarded and briefly younger. I'll text you from mine. You already did. Then you have it. I do. She looked at him for another moment, the kind of moment that, in a different kind of story, would be made larger than it was. Scored, lit differently, extended until it became symbolic of everything the evening had meant. This was not that kind of moment. It was just 2 tired people in a parking lot who had found something in each other that they hadn't been looking for and were being honest, in their different ways, about not knowing what to do with it yet. Drive safe, Victoria said. You too. She walked to her car. He got into his truck. He sat for the 2 or 3 seconds he always gave himself between places. And then he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot onto the wet street and drove home. Ava woke up about halfway there, in the particular disoriented way of children coming out of a car sleep, looking around for a moment as if recalibrating what dimension she'd returned to, then recognizing the street and settling back. Are we almost home? 2 minutes. She rubbed her eyes. Looked out the window at the passing houses, the porch lights, the ordinary geography of the neighborhood she'd grown up in. Then she said, without any particular emphasis, "She's nice?" Cole kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah. Like actually nice. Not just being nice because it's her job. I know the difference. I know you do." Ava pulled her knees up to her chest, which she did when she was thinking something through. She asked me a lot of questions about the drawing, about school, about soccer. A pause. She asked about Mom. Cole's hands tightened on the wheel by a degree. "What did you say?" "I said she was an artist too, and that she died when I was 5, and that you were really sad for a long time, but that you were better now." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things about her mother, with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who had processed grief at an age when grief and reality were still the same substance, before they separated into distinct experiences. "Was that okay?" "Yeah," he said. "That was okay." She didn't say she was sorry in that way people say sorry, where you can tell they just want the subject to be done. She just said she sounded like someone worth knowing. Cole didn't say anything for a moment. "She was," he said finally. Ava nodded, satisfied. She looked back out the window. The house was visible at the end of the block. The porch light on because he'd forgotten to turn it off that morning, a fact that would have annoyed him on any other night, but that tonight made the house look like something waiting for them. He pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. "Dad?" "Yeah." Ava turned to look at him with those wide, dark eyes, and for a moment she looked very much like her mother. Not in a painful way, not in the way that sometimes ambushed him, but in the way that occasionally, cleanly, reminded him that loss and love were not opposite experiences, but the same experience wearing different faces depending on the light. "You did a good thing tonight," she said. "At the diner, the first thing. When you stood up." "We've been over this." "I know. I just wanted to say it again." She picked up her backpack from the floor. "Because I think sometimes people do good things, and nobody says it out loud afterward, and then the person doesn't know if it mattered." He looked at his daughter. "It mattered," he said, though he was fairly sure she was talking about more than just him. "Good." She opened the car door and the cold air came in. "Also, I ate some of the pie." "I know." "You're not mad?" "I'm a little mad." "Okay." She got out of the car. "That's fair." He sat in the truck for another moment after she'd gone inside. Longer than the usual 2 or 3 seconds. Long enough to feel the specific quiet of a car after another person has left it. He was not a man who indulged in extended reflection, not as a rule, but tonight he gave himself this much, the length of a long breath, in and out, and the acknowledgement that the evening had changed something, though he couldn't have told you exactly what. Something had shifted, not dramatically. Nothing about it was clean or resolved or complete. Victoria Sinclair was still a woman he barely knew who ran a $900 million operation and chose to spend her weekends carrying plates, and he was still a man who fixed broken things in commercial buildings and raised a 9-year-old daughter and drove home a different way when someone needed the quiet. Those facts were not going to simplify themselves. He didn't expect them to. But the shift was real. He was sure of that. He went inside. Ava was already upstairs. The sound of water running in the bathroom, the ordinary percussion of a Friday night ending the way Friday nights did. He locked the front door and turned off the porch light and stood in the front hallway for a moment in the dark before his eyes adjusted. His phone buzzed. Victoria. A text, no message, just a contact card. Her actual number saved as Victoria, not through Margaret, which made him stand in his dark hallway and laugh quietly to himself for a moment. The kind of laugh that doesn't need an audience. The kind that happens when something small and true lands exactly right. He saved the contact, put the phone in his pocket, went upstairs. 3 weeks later, he wore the one good jacket he owned. The charcoal one his sister had made him buy for a funeral 2 years ago, and that had been in the back of his closet since, still in the dry cleaning bag. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at himself with the expression of a man who has arrived at a point he did not anticipate arriving at and is making the honest assessment of whether he is ready for it, knowing that honest assessment and readiness are not the same thing, and that one of them would have to be enough. He was not ready. He was going anyway. That had always been how the things worth doing worked. Ava was sitting on the end of his bed when he came out, still in her soccer clothes from practice, eating an apple with the critical focus of a person conducting an evaluation. "You look okay," she said. "Thanks. The jacket's good. The shoes need work." He looked down at his shoes. "These are my good shoes." "Dad!" She said it with a patience that suggested she was carrying something heavy. "Those are your work shoes with the scuffs buffed off." That is what good shoes are. She considered arguing and apparently decided it wasn't worth it, which meant she'd concluded the shoes were fine and had just wanted to register an opinion. He recognized this tactic because she'd inherited it from him. "Mrs. Okafor is coming at 7, he said. Mrs. Okafor was 2 houses down, 63, retired, and had the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had raised 4 children and found other people's children to be comparatively manageable. "She'll do dinner with you." "I know. We have a system." "What kind of system?" "She brings the cards. I pretend not to know how to play. She teaches me for an hour. I let her win the last game." Ava took another bite of apple. "It's our thing." He looked at her. "You let her win?" "She's 63, Dad. It would be rude." He opened his mouth and closed it again and decided this was not the hill. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet when Ava was present but occupied, a warm, inhabited silence rather than an empty one. He thought about Victoria's company dinner, 400 people in a room where most of the conversations would be structured around what each person wanted from every other person, and felt the particular low-grade resistance that he always felt toward rooms like that. Not anxiety, not avoidance, just the tiredness of a man who had spent his professional life in situations where the stakes were not hypothetical, and who found purely social performance kind of exhausting. He was going anyway. He'd said yes in a parking lot 3 weeks ago to a woman who had asked for honesty, and he wasn't going to walk it back because rooms with rubber chicken made him tired. His phone lit up on the counter. "Victoria, the centerpieces are terrible. I want you to know that going in." "I didn't pick them. My assistant picked them, and I should have asked more questions." He smiled at his phone. "What's wrong with them? They're very tall. You can't see the person across from you. The whole point of a dinner is to see the people you're eating with, and these things are the height of a small child." "Maybe that's the point. Maybe everyone at this dinner is easier to talk to when you can't see them." A pause. Then, "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me about this event, and you've never been to it. I'm perceptive." "You are, actually." Another pause. "Thank you for coming tonight. I mean that before it happens, not just after." He looked at the text. At the kitchen around him. The counter with the coffee maker that needed descaling, the calendar on the wall with Ava's soccer schedule, and school dates marked in different colors of ink. The drawing Ava had done last weekend now stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet, a horse with very careful eyes. He thought about what Ava had said on the drive home 3 weeks ago, that sometimes people did good things, and nobody said it out loud, and so the person didn't know if it mattered. He thought about a room full of people who had looked away, about the specific cost of being the one who didn't, about how it had not been heroic, not in any register he recognized. He had just looked at something that was wrong and found that he couldn't make himself look somewhere else. He thought about Victoria in a diner apron, reading a room with the eyes of someone who had never stopped needing to understand what a room actually contained, about Ava giving away a drawing she hadn't planned to give away, about Margaret Holloway standing in a diner at 9:45 on a Friday night saying, with the precision of someone who meant it exactly as stated, "I heard there was some trouble." He thought about Wallace Hargrove walking out into the rain, about the particular silence of a door swinging shut. He thought about what his daughter had said, that the thing that made it the real thing was that he hadn't known, that he'd stood up without the information that would have made standing up feel safer or more justified, or more clearly worth it. He had stood up with nothing but the plainest possible reason, because it was wrong, and he was there, and he was the kind of person who had to do something about that, even when doing something about it cost him, because the other option was becoming someone he didn't want his daughter to grow up watching. That was all. There was nothing larger in it than that. He had never thought of himself as someone with a philosophy about courage or integrity, or what it meant to be a man worth something. He was just a person trying not to fail the people in his vicinity, which included strangers on a Friday night in a diner when the situation called for it. He typed back to Victoria, "You don't have to thank me before. Just call me if the centerpieces are as bad as you say, and I'll confirm that they are." Her reply was fast. "Deal." Then, "Also, your daughter texted me." He stopped. "How does she have your number?" She says, and I'm quoting, "I'm 9, not 5. Apparently that explains it. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "What did she say?" "She said if I made you uncomfortable tonight, I should know she's very good at finding people." A pause. "I like her very much. She grows on you. She grew on me the first night. Now I'm just keeping up." He put the phone in his pocket and got his jacket from the hook by the door and called upstairs. "I'm leaving. Mrs. Okafor has the number. Don't stay up past 10. Ava's voice floated down from her room. "Have fun." "Don't say it like that." "Like what?" "You know like what." A brief silence, then, with complete and deliberate innocence, "I don't know what you mean. Have a nice evening, Father." He opened the front door and let the cold night air in and stood on the porch for a second, the way he always stood for a second between places. The street was ordinary and quiet. Someone's porch light down the block was on a timer, clicking off just as he looked at it. A dog barked once, twice, and stopped. He had survived deployments in 3 countries. He had carried wounded men through situations that didn't resolve cleanly. He had gotten up every morning for 4 years in the particular grinding dark of a grief that didn't announce its depth until you were already in it. He had raised a 9-year-old daughter who let elderly neighbors win at cards and gave away drawings she wasn't planning to give away, and had called a woman she'd known for 3 hours to issue a quiet protective warning on her father's behalf. He had fixed a pipe on a Wednesday that had tried very hard to ruin someone's building. He had stood up in a diner when everyone else sat down, not because he was brave, not because he had a code he'd memorized, but because he looked at something wrong and found he could not make himself small enough to unsee it. None of it was a complete picture. He was not a complete picture. He was a man with ceiling tile residue on a jacket he owned for funerals and shoes that were, honestly, probably work shoes with the scuffs buffed off, going to a dinner he would find exhausting, with a woman he barely knew who had surprised him entirely, and a daughter at home who was going to let an elderly neighbor win at cards and was not going to sleep before 10 regardless of what he said. He stepped off the porch and walked to his truck. Behind him, through Ava's window, he could hear the sound of her music. Something she'd been playing on repeat lately, something with a guitar, and a voice he didn't recognize, the edges of it reaching him faintly through the glass. He didn't know the song. He probably should have asked by now. He made a note to ask. He got in the truck, started the engine, and drove. Through the ordinary wet streets of a city that was just a city, toward whatever the rest of the night was going to be. Not certain, not resolved, not a clean ending with a lesson attached, just forward, just the next thing, and then the thing after that, which was all any of it had ever been. The music from Ava's window faded behind him after the first block. He didn't look back.